You have just been watching the Thames television symbol. Watch it again. Yes, it's a symbol we all hold close to our hearts. And not only our hearts, but our liver and onions as well. Yes, Thames Television, the only station with Queen Anne legs, 3 knobbly knees, 2 left feet, and a cauliflower nose.
And now...
That there London. Obviously the most important place in the entire country, if not the world. There's a clock and a wheel and everything. And that's why it's where both the BBC and ITV got their starts. The first ITV franchise to go live, and in fact the first commercial TV station in Europe, began broadcasting on September 22nd, 1955. This was the catchily named Associated-Rediffusion. Associated was a popular generic business/broadcasting type word in those days. 3 out of the original 4 ITV companies had it in their names to sound important. Rediffusion, meanwhile, is a made-up word that essentially just means rebroadcasting. Its chairman was Captain Thomas Brownrigg, RN, retired, a sort of Lord Reith reimagined as a naval commander. He'd been one of the commanders at D-Day and tended to run his companies the same way he ran his battleships. It's tempting to think of Brownrigg himself as part of the reason ITV got started in the first place. It seems genuinely alien now, but the whole notion of commercial broadcasting in the UK was widely decried as sick and wrong by many of the policy makers at the time. Brownrigg's approach might just have helped mollify them, because his strategy for Associated-Rediffusion was to be twice as deferential and stately as the BBC. Take a look at their clock, for example.
Associated-Rediffusion from London.
Known as Mitch, after the company's head of presentation Leslie Mitchell, who incidentally had done the same thing for the BBC's fledgling television service back in the 30s, this combination of Art Deco timepiece and coat of arms, complete with lion and griffin, was in essence an upraised middle finger to the BBC. Only classier. I accused Southern of being more Alexandra Palace than thou, but next to the early AR, they were positively vulgar. The company logo itself, however, was altogether lighter of heart. It was known as the Adastral, after Adastral House, the original name for Rediffusion's headquarters, which in turn had come from the RAF slogan Per Ardua ad Astra, from adversity to the stars, Adastral House having been the HQ for the Air Ministry. Hang on, I think I've lost the thread of what I was saying. So the Adastral was simple, memorable, dynamic with its carefully angled arms giving the illusion of motion even when static, and unlike anything else around in the British broadcasting world of the mid-50s. Although its Art Deco feel was, at the time, highly contemporary. The poker-faced, hyper-serious pomposity that Rediffusion wanted to project was actually punctured a little by their own symbol, but this turned out to be a good thing. Because there had been a very real danger of Rediffusion, and by that token ITV itself, trying so hard to out-BBC the BBC that it came across as nothing more than a clone, a shirt-tail rider. The same thing with adverts, ultimately pointless. The Adastral helped set it apart. Of course, Rediffusion wasn't the only game in town, even in those first few months when ITV only existed in London. Weekdays and weekends had separate franchises, and from a couple of days after Rediffusion's launch, the Saturday and Sunday shift in the capital was handled by ITV. Of course, ATV's history was covered in full, explicit, hardcore detail in the Midlands episode, so we won't dwell. I mean, the idents themselves were basically identical anyway, with the exception of the word Midlands becoming the word London, of course. So Rediffusion spent the better part of the next 10 years as the ITV network's standard bearer, sweating blood on a daily basis to disprove the notion that commercial television by its very nature had to be vulgar and crass, that the pressures of the marketplace would force them to dive for the lowest common denominator in order to sell whatever it is that needs selling. An entirely cynical notion which was proven entirely correct 50 years down the line. But even then they'd needed a high place to fall from, and AR provided that. Brownrigg and Company's classier than an eagle perching on a marble bust of Mozart image and attitude successfully made ITV respectable, despite the creation of game shows like Double Your Money and Take Your Pick, and a career for Hughie Green. In 1964 the first franchise review occurred, and everyone survived, except a Lady Cymru, whose entire history was covered in about a minute flat earlier in the series. Almost a decade into the ITV network's life, it was already a brave new world. Miniskirts and Beatles and mods and all sorts of things. And at the centre of this cultural revolution was London, making Rediffusion effectively the official host broadcaster of the swinging 60s. Obviously they couldn't keep the BBC with adverts image, it would be the equivalent of your dad at the disco. Besides, BBC Two was around the corner, with an initial remit aiming at these young persons and middle classes and such. So they ditched Mitch and the Art Deco solemnity, and they ditched the man who created it. Brownrigg, increasingly a relic of an old, pre-Attlee, pre-consensus Britain, was pensioned off to Berkshire, probably shaking his head in resignation and bewilderment. And the station was rebranded, dropping the Associated and emphasising the city. The Adastral went from being the symbol of authority to the face of swinging London, or at least that was the intention. The brand new Rediffusion London stood vanguard at a cultural revolution, by which I don't mean it suddenly became a Maoist channel, I mean, you know what I mean. Rediffusion went from strength to strength right alongside its city, enjoying the kind of outsized success that can really only lead to the sound of a record scratching. Thank you, Bruce. The second franchise round followed hot on the heels of the first in 1967, and this time it wasn't just a rubber stamping session. Fundamental changes were to be made to ITV's structure, and not everyone would make it out alive. Regions were carved up and reassigned, most notably resulting in the creation of Yorkshire Television. And crucially, separate weekend franchises were on the way out. Except in London. With ATV set to go 7 days a week in the Midlands, everyone expected their erstwhile weekend partners to bid for and win their London weekend franchise. They were half right. ABC did bid against ATV, but neither won out. Instead, an up-and-coming and painfully highbrow consortium, led by a sharp young David called Frost, came from nowhere to dazzle Lord Hill and the ITA into giving them the licence, snatching it out from under both major companies. We'll come back to them. First, consider how ABC must have felt. With their shock defeat in London and the scrapping of the weekend franchises in the North and Midlands, they suddenly found themselves out in the cold. Redundant. Defunct. Effectively amputated from the ITV network through no real fault of their own. And this was obviously tragic. Not least because they were a big company. A very big company. And perhaps more importantly, a money spinner. They made the likes of the Avengers, Callan, the Armchair Theatre Archipelago, and plenty of other licensed to print money exports that were suddenly under threat without the guaranteed income of a major television station. Of course, nowadays, that would mean basically nothing, and ABC would still have been kicked in the arse and left to die in the snow. And truth be told, it might have been fairer if they'd done that. Meanwhile, Rediffusion had spent the entire franchise review acting like massive entitled dick horses, assuming their victory rather than doing anything to earn it, and at one point claiming the ITA actually owed them for keeping the network afloat during the tricky early years when a lot of companies looked like going bankrupt. And while that's not factually untrue,
seems like the classy thing to do would be not to call attention to it.
This did not endear them to the authority. Determined to have ABC survive, the ITA proposed a forced merger. The resulting company would run London's weekday service, and it would be controlled by ABC. Rediffusion were understandably unimpressed with the notion, particularly that last bit. But as it transpired, there was nothing they could do about it. When they appealed to the ITA, they were given only one other option: step aside and let ABC take over the franchise single-handed. Now, this was a transparent bluff. ABC didn't have those kind of resources, and both the ITA and Rediffusion knew it. But Rediffusion were classy enough not to call it, and instead accepted their fate. It wasn't really a true merger so much as a wholly new company reconstituted out of the ashes of ABC and Rediffusion. The station's working name was ABC London, but that was neither tactful nor especially popular, so they gave it a nice neutral name, one pertaining to London rather than any particular company. They called it Thames. And so, instead of ABC being killed off through no fault of their own, Associated-Rediffusion took the bullet. In a potent reminder that injustice didn't start with the Broadcasting Act 1990, it was just canonised by it. A slim justification can be found in the fact that the Rediffusion parent company, with its fingers in all sorts of media pies, was far bigger than ABC's and could survive on its own, and did for several decades. But that was scant consolation to Captain Brownrigg, who was horrified but powerless at the effective death of his company, and finally died in October 1967, providing a definitive full stop on an entire ITV era. The Lord Reith of ITV never lived to see his precious Rediffusion replaced. On the 29th of July 1968, Rediffusion went off air for the last time. On the 30th, a legend was born. This might not be what you're expecting to see, of course, but it genuinely was the first Thames ident seen on the television. The second is slightly more familiar. These two ran concurrently for the first couple of years of Thames' existence, and since this is nearly 50 years ago, and with the best will in the world extremely trivial, no one is entirely certain about this, but it's generally accepted that the plain one was used in the region for programmes made in the old Rediffusion studios, whereas the Skyline one was used for material made under the auspices of what had been ABC. Almost a final twist of the knife to Rediffusion, really. The famous jingle, known as the Salute to Thames, went through a few tweaks and polishes, but ultimately never changed until 1989. Though now legendary, the chiming 8-note jingle wasn't the only choice, and indeed evolved as they went along, out of various ideas and motifs, usually based on London folk tunes. The animation was settled on first, which enabled them to try out a whole raft of ideas over the top of it. From straight-laced versions of Origins and Lemons, or Who Will Buy from Oliver, which does seem to have influenced the final tune, to a quote of London Bridge is Falling Down, to a simple and wholesale repurposing of the ABC music, which was obviously never going to fly. Eventually, Alan Hawksworth pulled it all together to create the iconic salute that we still love to this day. The dynasty had begun. 2 days later, on August the 2nd, another new station was born. The late Dr. David Frost was just beginning the first phase of his transition from television satirist to heavyweight interviewer. He'd just been working for Rediffusion on the Frost programme, interrogating the likes of Ian Smith and Enoch Powell. Frost felt that London's weekend providers, ITV, were failing to pull their weight, with their programming being lowbrow and down-market and far too heavily reliant on imports. With that in mind, he gathered together a few other North London types, mostly from the corridors of the BBC, like Michael Peacock, the controller of BBC One, and Frank Muir, the corporation's comedian without portfolio. Together they formed the London Television Consortium. Their mission statement was a return to the Brownriggian model of upmarket programming and direct competition with BBC One, rather than BBC Two. This chimed quite harmoniously with the ITA, still stinging from the Pilkington report, which had basically accused the entire network of the things that Frost had said about ATV. They desperately needed to seem vaguely classy again, especially in the capital. And so, to the surprise of both ATV and ABC, and almost everyone else involved in fact, Frost's consortium were given the London Weekend franchise. In the heady days leading up to the launch of the new station, these young Turks were seen as the great white hope of the ITV network, the only serious contender for quality programming against the BBC. This, for the ITA, justified the genuine risk in awarding what was still a relatively major franchise to a man who, despite his attempts at reinvention at Rediffusion, was still seen largely as a comedian, and who, more importantly, had no experience whatsoever in the running of a TV station. In the authorities' own words, the consortium had to have their chance, whatever the repercussions. So the consortium settled in at the now defunct Rediffusion studios at Wembley. ABC's were nicer, but they were keeping them for precisely that reason, and tried to come up with a name. After rejecting the silly, frivolous likes of Thames, they eventually settled on something baldly descriptive and courageously dull, with an ident to match. London Weekend Television had arrived. With an ident that married possibly the least interesting visuals in ITV's history, they were far too highbrow for a logo, with what sounds like a discarded outtake from one of Frank Zappa's mid-80s synclavier pieces. Of course, it's easy to scoff now. In 1968, this was all very innovative and fresh, not to mention subtly underlining the fact that this is a highbrow intellectual station and that. They did deign to introduce a graphical logo, not to mention an actual tune, a year later, vaguely reminiscent of those film festival laurel wreaths dotted around the posters for highbrow movies, crossed with an optical illusion. That same year, 1969, do keep up, colour intruded on the capital for the first time, and both companies understandably reacted by adapting their regular idents. London Weekend simply cast their spinny disc thing in a distinctive but not exactly pleasant shade of mustardy ochre. As for Thames, they had the music, they had the design, they simply refined it into one of the most recognisable TV symbols in British history. Look at the attention to detail on the reflection. That kind of effort is what really makes this special. It's visible evidence that the people behind it cared about what they were doing. They weren't simply marketing a product, joining focus grouped and brainstormed dots together. The ident was a product in itself, and its creators were completely undistracted by targeted branding and demographic penetration, but simply focused on creating something people would both remember and enjoy remembering. And it caught on instantly, remaining recognisable to this very day and becoming one of the cornerstones of British television's history. Obviously it helped that it was attached to some of the best television ever made in this country, certainly in the 70s and 80s, which is why they stuck with it for 2 full decades. It may have had a rum birth, to say the least, but Thames Television would go on to set the standard not only for ITV, but alongside the BBC for British television in general. London Weekend were less stable than the average Jenga tower in an earthquake. They were beset with problems from day one, minute one, in fact. For a start, there were major financial difficulties stemming from the fact that they'd inherited not only Rediffusion Studios, but their workforce, which was larger than they'd wanted or needed. Consequently, the wages were spread just a tiny bit thin, which was made even worse when you consider that these employees had lost 3 days of income just from the transition, and were actually holding out for a not unreasonable pay rise. This all came to a head on opening night, which eventually went a bit like this.
Thank you. Good.
15 seconds into the station's existence, the technicians walked out and the screens went blank. This dispute eventually spiralled to engulf the entire network and culminated in ITV itself melting down and broadcasting an emergency service for 3 weeks, as detailed in earlier episodes. Once that was sorted out and normal service could resume, or start in the first place, London Weekend faced a new problem, one which viewers of the TVAM episode may find hauntingly familiar. David Frost's relentlessly highbrow agenda was inexplicably not pulling in the ratings. For some completely inexplicable reason, it seemed like the viewers would rather watch Morecambe and Wise of a Saturday evening than a full-cast production of Hamlet or Der Erzführung aus dem Israel, even though the London Weekend Board had repeatedly told them how much better the latter was for them. And of course, the single-figure ratings they were attracting in their own region made the other ITV franchisees understandably wary of spending the cash to show their programmes elsewhere. Particularly the Midlands franchisee and their London Weekend predecessors, ITV, who flatly refused to take even an attosecond of their programming on general principles, even if they'd wanted it, which as it turned out, they didn't anyway. By the end of 1969, London Weekend was in such bad shape that the ITA actually drew up some emergency plans in the event of the company disintegrating altogether. Thames, for their part, reacted with a massive schadenfreudegasm that was really quite unbecoming. London Weekend hadn't actually done anything to them, after all, apart from being broadcast in the same region. They took the opportunity to slash their advertising rates, discouraging people still further from investing in London Weekend, and made a few surreptitious advances to the ITA on the subject of a potential 7-day contract, if London Weekend were to end up slashing their metaphorical wrists with a bit of metaphorical tin. The ITA scolded them for their blatant sauce. But it ultimately turned out to be irrelevant anyway. As the 70s began and London Weekend tottered on the point of total collapse, a saviour finally emerged from across the sea. A saviour named Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch had only just started to build the Empire of the Sun at this point. Having gained a horrible foothold in the newspaper industry, he was moving into television, and at the end of 1970 took a controlling stake and executive position at London Weekend, finally appointing himself managing director and all-seeing God Emperor of the company by February 1971. He'd chosen London Weekend partly because it was a soft target and partly out of a desire for revenge against David Frost, who'd shown him up in an interview on the station. So it goes. As soon as he'd secured total control of London Weekend, he started remaking the station in his own horrible image, firing board members left, right and centre, and personally revamping the schedules to aim for a new demographic. Somewhat lower, but far broader. This won him few friends, but it did win London Weekend some healthy ratings for the very first time in its history. And therefore, and far more importantly as far as Rupert was concerned, profit. A stung David Frost buggered off to America to regenerate into Michael Sheen and interrogate Nixon, but was back within a decade, heading up yet another new ITV station that started out with aspirations of being highbrow and hard-hitting, but was plagued by industrial action and barely discernible ratings, before being completely torn down and rebuilt into a massive, hollow success by an evil reptilian Australian.
Hello, good morning, and welcome to TVAM.
Thereby proving the axiom that history repeats itself the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. Murdoch's reign as the explicit king of London Weekend, however, was to be short-lived, as his presence in the network made the ITA uneasy. Not only was he a foreign national, but he owned several other very significant media interests in the UK. As for example, all things considered, the authority were far from convinced that this was the sort of person who should be allowed to own a British television station. And so they gave him an ultimatum. Step back from the running of London Weekend, or the company loses its licence. He chose the former, handing the chairmanship over to John Freeman, no less, who immediately rehired half of the staff that Rupert had fired. As for the Dark One, he eventually sold off his stake in London Weekend over the course of the decade, with the last chunk going in 1980. For now, he'd concentrate on his newspaper interests, while nursing a grudge against what he perceived to be the British class system, but was actually basic antitrust legislation. But like Skeletor, he'd be back. Murdoch left behind him a healthy company, something almost unthinkable a year earlier. The new London Weekend was unashamedly populist, with the likes of lovable, misogynistic sitcom On the Buses, pulling in the viewers with whatever the hell its appeal was. To reflect this, they adopted a newly brash and colourful logo and tune. It's based, though, on the Thames, which at one stage genuinely does resemble the letters L and W. A bit. And the forbidding martial drums of the original are replaced with xylophone and horn. Finally, London Weekend had an iconic symbol of their own, just like their weekday counterparts. So iconic was it, in fact, that within a few years it was being parodied left, right and centre by the likes of warm northern talkman Russell Harty, archetypal bad boy Just William, or edgy Marshall and Renwick sketch show End of Part 1. It was officially adapted once again in 1978, as the station was finally given a much less unwieldy logo and name. And so was born the face of middle and lowbrow light entertainment. LWT would be the exact opposite of David Frost's vision for London Weekend, right down to the fact that people actually watched the benighted thing. Of course, Thames weren't above having some fun with their ident too. When you create something this iconic, it's almost your duty to piss about with it. At one stage, the whole thing was eaten by a giant Pauline quirk. In the late 70s and early 80s, the famous tune was repurposed into a taunt at the BBC after they poached away their biggest stars. But the undisputed master of this form was the godlike genius Cuddly Kenny Everett. Cuddly Ken could never let the Thames ident form up normally. He filled it with beer for New Year. He made a concerto out of the jingle.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the concert hall here tonight, where we are about to hear the Thames television theme as played by the original composer, Igor Blimey. And here he is now. Mr. Blimey mounts the podium, and away he goes.
He replaced the London skyline with an eerie collage of breasts. Not even the continuity announcers were safe.
As you know, the next scheduled programme was to be the Kenny Everett video cassette, the new Thames comedy show starring Kenny Everett. Unfortunately, due to censorship problems this afternoon, it was decided that the show was unsuitable for public viewing. And so instead, we bring you a second showing of the programme originally broadcast in August 1978. It was first shown in October 1950.
You wouldn't see this these days. The modern equivalent would probably have Ant and Dex scampering around in the background of one of those live-action Blandathons, while Simon Cowell glares comically at them from a distance.
And now on Thames Television, the test card. And now on Thames Television, the obscene version.
Besides, we don't have continuity announcers you can see or relate to anymore. They barely even have discernible voices. Thames and LWT, as befitting the franchisees for the sainted capital city, had some of the best. The one cheerfully consenting to be abused by Kenny Everett was Philip Elsmore, who was there from start to finish and never wavered from his laid-back fun uncle persona, remaining deadpan even against the corpsing superpowers of Morecambe and Wise.
And from Eric and Ernie's Christmas show to a Minder Christmas bonus right after the break. Then at 10:45 we have the news from ITN, and at 10:50 it's Des O'Connor Tonight. And with Des O'Connor will be Jimmy Tarbuck, Marty Kane, Charlie Callis, and those some of the...
They also had Diddy David Hamilton when he wasn't on Radio 1.
Good evening. We've got an action-packed evening for you tonight on Thames. But right now, here's a rotten old BBC programme.
And the exceedingly dry Irishman, Peter Marshall, if anything more deadpan than Elsmore.
On to University Challenge of 3, so if you fancy a battle of the brain box, frankly, I can never get any of them right. That's the time for you and Bamba. New Thames News headlines, 3:25.
The weekend team was headed up by Peter Lewis, who was less avuncular than the likes of Elsmore, though hardly a stone-faced martinet, but his announcing technique was more like a curator than an uncle, introducing programmes with great import and an undertone of gratitude that the viewer has actively chosen to watch LWT.
The I-5 is back in action in the form of The Professionals. That's this Sunday night at 9 o'clock. But now, staying with action, it's time for SWAT, and this week's episode is Witness.
If that's just too much pressure for you, there was also the throaty Hilary Osborne, who had one of those voices where the words really don't matter as long as she keeps talking.
From London Weekend Television on this Saturday night. I hope you've enjoyed being with us, as I have with you, and will be able to join us again sometime tomorrow. We'll be here all day, but as we're all up so late this evening, let's start by looking at our programmes tomorrow.
Both companies breezed through the 1980 franchise round with no trouble at all, if only because David Frost was busy. By now, both were among the biggest providers of network programming on the ITV network, and while it's undoubtedly a facile generalisation to divide them into Thames making the quality shows and LWT the populist idents, it's not entirely inaccurate. Just bear in mind that LWT made Upstairs Downstairs and Thames made Love Thy Neighbour.
Love thy neighbour.
Presentation-wise, things stayed more or less as you were. Thames certainly had no reason to revamp their image. The skyline had now become shorthand for quality programming, despite those few aberrations.
What? It's them niglogs next door.
They simply gave the skyline a touch of spit and polish every so often. Over in Weekend Land, the stripy LWT logo had long since detached itself from its river-related form-up and was now happily being repurposed for bumpers and trailers in a variety of animated guises. The ident itself, however, still used the river, which was starting to look a bit tatty, not to mention terribly old-fashioned by the mid-80s in the wake of all that computer wizardry that was going on. So in 1986 they gave themselves a new, glossier image, beefing up the colours but otherwise going the BBC Two route of carefully managed understatement, rather than Channel 4's more immediate and explosive aesthetic. They made two idents, both with distinctive and poncy names. This one is Solari, and this one is Genesis. They weren't simply interchangeable. Genesis was the main ident, seen nationwide before the likes of Play Your Cards Right or The Two of Us. Solari was seen in London only, but for specifically regional programming. They're really very nice idents, maybe a tiny bit dry, but definitely authoritative, and arguably a much better and more confident use of the technology than certain others I could name. The computer serves the design, not the other way around. A cynic might suggest that the idents were actually more upmarket than the majority of the programming, but then that's what idents are for. Besides, it's a weekend station, what do you expect? Because of the potential for dullness, there was also a special ident made to go before kids programming, which... take a look. Yes, kids dig Persil adverts. Who knew? In 1989, both stations celebrated their 21st anniversary, which again was considered more important than the 20th because of reasons. LWT gave us this none more 1989 time-related artifact, while Thames were moved to change their ident for the very first time in their history, assuming you don't count the original black and white version of the skyline as somehow distinct from the colour version, which you frankly shouldn't since it's blatantly the same design. I think the jingles lost a bit of charm in the rearrangement, especially with that extra bar, but then that's the 80s for you. Besides, this was never intended to be on screens for long, and ultimately there would be multiple reasons why it wasn't. For a start, of course, the generic look came along almost immediately afterwards, and both Thames and LWT cheerfully accepted it. Being the centerpieces of the entire network, they really had to. The whole thing would have collapsed even faster than it did. It helped that both their logos were fairly well suited to adaptation, particularly Thames's new triangular motif. Alright, LWT's didn't look like LWT anymore, but at least it was reminiscent, unlike certain others. Thames also turned out to be the only company to have two distinct versions of this after they refined their corporate logo. So now we've seen all the ITV 1989 generic idents, aren't we privileged? But we still don't know why they bothered. Well, in many ways they came from, and were symptoms of, a low point in relations between British government and British broadcasting. The BBC in particular had narrowly escaped being dismantled altogether for perceived slights against Thatcher, including but not limited to existing as a public service broadcaster unsupported by advertising. But if any ITV company had thought that the mere fact of being commercial would be adequate protection, they were wrong. The broadcasting bill was being debated and refined, and it was set to completely restructure the commercial network. The 1989 rebranding of ITV as a unified whole was intended as a show of confidence and defiance, spearheaded by an earlier campaign that made decidedly unsubtle use of just the way you are.
I want you just the way you are.
Of course, it didn't work. As things turned out, one of Thatcher's main targets inside ITV was to be Thames. They'd incurred the wrath of the Prime Minister at exactly the wrong time, shortly after her unprecedented third straight victory, the height of her Pinochet address phase. In March 1988, 3 IRA members were gunned down in Gibraltar by the SAS in a sort of small-scale, sun-kissed remake of Bloody Sunday. This was Operation Flavius. The eventual intent of the 3 IRA douchebags, to set off a car bomb at the changing of the guard, was and is not in dispute. That they were at the time unarmed and without anything remotely explosive in sight was also unfortunately the case, and was initially kept on the old DL. The official story that ran in the papers the next day had the deceased working on their car bomb in broad daylight when the SAS heroically jumped in and defused it, tragically sparking off a gun battle that the SAS ended up winning 3-0. In reality, Flavius had been intended to be an arrest mission, but in typical SAS style they just jumped straight in like idiots, riddled the three of them with several hospitals worth of bullets, and buggered off again to write a book about it. What does this have to do with Thames Television? Well, 6 weeks later, ITV broadcast an episode of Thames' World in Action equivalent, This Week, entitled Death on the Rock. In it, David Bolton and Julian Mannion carefully presented the case that the official story was bollocks, the IRA members were unarmed, there was no bomb about to go off, and the whole operation was so badly mishandled it essentially resulted in exactly the sort of cold-blooded murder the IRA had been planning all along, with the implication that such actions are not rendered acceptable just because the victims were the bad guys. Thatcher heard about the programme prior to broadcast and immediately demanded the IBA pull the show altogether. The IBA refused, citing freedom of the press and the fact that ostensibly we weren't living in a totalitarian state, and the show went out. Thatcher had to content herself with using her compliant press to whip up a storm of controversy, accusing Bolton personally of colluding with the IRA, and openly decrying one of the show's main witnesses as a whore. I wish I was making that part up. For the record, an independent inquiry not only cleared the programme makers of all wrongdoing, but actually praised the show as a trenchant work of journalism and a shining example of freedom of expression, much to Thatcher's annoyance. As a final insult, it won the BAFTA for Best Documentary the following year. Fortunately for the Prime Minister, and unfortunately for almost everyone else, the broadcasting bill was still rattling around the Commons trying to fix what wasn't broken. Ironically, the IBA had actually done their jobs with regards to Death on a Rock, insisting on a handful of cuts to remove some potentially leading language, before finally approving it for broadcast. But obviously that was far from enough. No matter how even-handed it might have been, with or without the IBA's interference, simply presenting an opposing viewpoint to the government was tantamount to treason. The whole mess over Death on the Rock served to strengthen the Prime Minister's resolve to deregulate ITV and destroy the IBA. And if she could get Thames at the same time, so much the better. Thames didn't really expect to lose their licence in 1991. Their bid of $32 million certainly seemed strong. Besides that, surely they were far too big and valuable to the network to be summarily executed purely on the basis of a cash sum. The ITC, toothless successors to the IBA, had an extraordinary circumstances clause embedded in the system. And should the worst happen, Thames reasoned, that would surely get them home and dry. They were half right.
Thames, the biggest programme supplier to the national ITV network, was outbid by Carlton Television, the media services company.
The highest bid actually came from a consortium named CPV-TV, headed up by Richard Branson and that man David Frost again, having apparently learned nothing. They'd actually bid for 3 franchises at once, London, East Anglia and the South, hoping to merge them together under one cohesive identity. The ITC failed them on quality grounds, but Thames still ended up dead last, behind a company that had tried to break into ITV for years and had finally made it thanks largely to their CEO, Michael P. Green, a good friend of Thatcher and an in-law of the President of the Board of Trade. According to some accounts, the entire blind auction winner-takes-all system was originally his suggestion. and he benefited from it arguably more than any other single individual, snatching up the jewel in the crown, the London weekday franchise. That this condemned one of Britain's leading television companies to a slow death was completely and utterly irrelevant. They shouldn't have got in his way. And so Thames Television, the station that brought us Callan, Rainbow, Minder, Rumpole, Kenny Everett, The Sweeney, The World at War, in many ways the ITV station, was suddenly and arbitrarily no more. Condemned and sitting on death row, awaiting their appointment with the noose on New Year's Eve 1992. So how did they take it? Well, their immediate reaction was to drop the ITV generic look in favour of something defiantly themselves. They'd adopted that triangle thing for a corporate logo, inspired by the 21st anniversary look, in 1990. Now they had an ident to go with it. The second great Thames ident. For my money, at least the equal of the skyline, and with a haunting new salute to boot. Bold, brassy, and even defiant, its only touch of melancholy comes from its place in history. If you didn't know this was their last ident, you'd never guess. This is the calling card of a company in rude health. Meanwhile, LWT looked on appalled as their hated rivals were repeatedly stabbed in the back. The two companies had never really got on, even back in the days of London Weekend's highbrow agenda and negligible ratings. The fallout from Thames's active prickmanship in lowering their advertising spend had led to an unspoken but actual policy of both sides never promoting each other's programming if they could help it. But in 1991, this civil war was abruptly terminated. LWT won, by default. In contrast to Thames, they hadn't had too much trouble at the 1991 auction. They did suffer a bit of a scare when their relatively modest £7.5 million bid was trounced by a consortium led by Polygram executive Michael Coombe, who bid £35 million. But they failed at both the quality threshold and at proving they could afford that kind of annual stipend. And so LWT won again by default, with a relatively low tithe, if you discount the Survivors Guild. After a proud year-long victory lap, Thames Television departed from the ITV network on December 31st, 1991. There was much talk of their intention to continue as an independent production company, but without the solid foundation of a full-blown TV station, they were never going to be as great of a force again. And within 2 years had been sold off to Pearson Television, and from thence to RTL, where it became just another brand name to randomly bestow upon newly created subsidiaries. May whoever designed that thing burn in the same hell as Bruce Gintrell. Thames's final broadcast, the end of the year show, was a clip show of Thames's many contributions to British television over the near quarter century of its existence. It was shown nationwide, except in the other doomed regions, and was followed by a brief and graceful message from the company's chief executive, Richard Dunn. The speech was short, to the point, and betrayed not an iota of bitterness toward the ITC or anyone else, even though Thames had 8 times as much reason to be bitter as, say, Southern or TWW.
We wish all of you a happy new year.
There then followed one last montage, accompanied by the tourist version of I Only Wanna Be With You. But there was always hope. Although these new boys had been around the block for a while, we, the public, didn't know much about them. There was still a chance they might honour the legacy of Thames. Maybe, just maybe this new station could be as worthwhile as the last.
Thames, a talent for television.
A few seconds from midnight, let's go over to Westminster for the chimes of Big Ben.
Just in case we weren't already sure that the game was up, Thames's replacements made it clear from the outset. The clumsy transition between channels was forgivable enough, but the idents, in many ways they're ahead of their time, prefiguring the likes of the BBC One dancers from the early aughties, only without even their charm or visual invention. The desperate and somewhat patronising centre staging of ordinaries just smacks of an attempt to make it seem like they give a care about their region, when in actual fact they had also bid for TVS and would very probably have used much the same idents there. The ordinaries would have been different people, but basically the same nonetheless. Even the name is completely neutral. Carlton, a name picked almost at random by Michael Green a decade earlier because it sounded vaguely classy, meaning nothing whatsoever to London itself. And just to make matters worse, these idents were designed by Lambie Nairn, clearly having used up all their good ideas on reinventing the BBC 2 years earlier.
Oh, yes. Good. Yes. Did I look okay? Was I smiling?
Thank you, lovely.
Oh, lovely.
Next, please.
At least the weekends were untouched. By 1992, LWT had got bored with the generic ident and replaced it with something that took its audiovisual cues from its predecessor, but was much more bombastic and, of course, much more individual. This stuck around, both with and without the ITV logo slapped on the bottom, until 1996. By now, LWT were owned by Granada, having left themselves something of a sitting duck by bidding so little and yet winning the franchise. And the new governors decided to give the station an overhaul, one that resulted in a rather nice ident.
This is LWT.
A lovely little piece of modernist bothering surrealism, with a terrific tune, composed incidentally by the same people who wrote the equally awesome theme music for Rockcliffe's Baby. Which is admittedly trivial even by the standards of this programme, but at this point I don't care. Biggest change of all, of course, is the logo. Based on the old one, but simplified and streamlined for the go-go 90s. The only thing that could have improved it is if anyone really cared about LWT anymore. But few did, beyond its status as a page in Granada's portfolio. Carlton jacked in their initial idents after a couple of years, replacing them with these rather lovely, light-based totalitarian chic confections. Having with laudable efficiency already picked up a somewhat less than highbrow, less than high quality reputation, these were a transparent attempt at cultivating something resembling a classy image, for the regional viewers at least. They stopped caring about that fairly quickly, and in the same year that LWT's new look was launched, traded down to these calculatedly quirky things, again unaccountably made by Lambie Nairn. You'll remember these from the Midlands episode with the word Central in place of Carlton, because they started hoovering up franchises and rebranding them to match themselves. Central at least initially got to keep their name, but of course that didn't last. In 1998, LWT celebrated their 30th anniversary, but the cake was ashes in their mouths, as the company hadn't really existed as more than a brand name for several years. They were just another subsidiary of Granada, which is probably why they offered so little resistance when the Granada-led 1999 generic look came along, at least at first. Carlton, on the other hand, took the opportunity of killing off Central and their other victim West Country once and for all, introducing a whole new brand identity for all three regions. Again, we've seen it several times already. Seen entirely separately from their historical context, these idents were genuinely good. Lambie Nairn finally came through for Carlton. I'm sure both Leigh and Carlton would argue that the use of a heart motif, matching that of the generic look, was a mere coincidence. It hardly matters. Although it is worth a chuckle at the idea of a heart motif for this most heartless of ITV companies. Meanwhile, the Hearts idents were turning out to work surprisingly badly for LWT. And so in 2000, they became the only ITV station to actively drop them. Unfortunately, the replacement was worse. Theoretically, the video wall is a nice enough idea, but it's done out in horribly clashing shades of pinks, purples and blues, moving altogether too fast across the screen, creating the impression that you've been set spinning in the middle of the worst nightclub in Banbury. And the music is useless. Again, the tune is fine, if you can discern it, but it's arranged as a series of bleeps and bloops that doggedly refuse to allow the melody to go anywhere. The continuity announcers hated it. It gave them nothing to build on. It was like trying to act next to a man in a giant foam rubber fish costume. Ultimately impossible. So within a year it was refined. The colours are more subtle, the animation marginally less queasy, and the tune is finally discernible. Almost a pretty good ident. But of course this was just delaying the inevitable. And in 2002, the regions as a concept were negated, as the world, or at least England and Wales, beheld ITV1. Of course, what with the generic idents and everything, most of the regions were dead already. But LWT, with its mostly unique ident, were as close to semi-autonomous as any of them got. They were left holding the torch for the old regional ITV. And on the very last day before ITV1 arrived, they acknowledged it.
This is London Weekend Television, broadcasting a colour 625-line analogue service on the UHF band and also on digital terrestrial, digital satellite and digital cable networks via the MPEG-2 encoding system.
They began after GMTV with a traditional startup. They used all the old logos and slides throughout the day. They finally came to an end with a final in-vision message from Trish Bertram and Glenn Thompson. It was reminiscent, of course, of the sort of things that TSW and TVAM and TBS and even Southern had done for the same occasion.
They certainly will, Glenn.
The difference was that LWT were technically keeping the franchise.
Sadly, this is where you and I bow out.
It was just ceasing to mean anything.
So, for the final time,
from our studios on the South Bank,
this is LWT,
London Weekend Television.
These days, ITV is just a channel. It used to be a national network, a union of channels, each serving a different part of the country, simultaneously independent and interdependent. No one company could serve more than one region, but they all needed each other to keep the edifice upright. These days there's only one of them, with no regional differences beyond the 5-minute local news broadcasts, which can come from hundreds of miles away. And it's a different world now anyway. The old ITV could possibly have survived in the multi-channel digital age. Or so they say. The thing is, there were choices other than deregulation and homogenisation. Choices which didn't distance the viewer from the channel, that emphasised the broadcasting and programming above marketing and profit margins. Choices that no one in 1989 wanted to hear, even if there had been anyone back then with the imagination to think them up in the first place. But there used to be a place for invention. There used to be a place for charm. There used to be a place for a TV station to be your friend, or at the very least a helpful co-worker. The BBC was the boss, friendly but distant, serious and faceless. But ITV had faces, smiling ones that introduced Corrie as if holding a conversation with you, and odd iconographic logos that the BBC would never have thought up in a million years. It's not what Captain Brownrigg had in mind, but it's what he started. Under a twirling star on the Kingsway in London, 60 years ago. The kids down our way called it Channel 3. I tried to tell them it was TSW. But nationally, it was known as ITV. Independent television. Just imagine.
Until we see each other again, on behalf of all our TSW staff here in Plymouth and our IBA transmitter staff, this is Ian Sterling wishing you all a very good night.